In the autumn of 1857, the residents of Culpeper County, Virginia, witnessed what would later be described in hushed tones as one of the most disturbing manipulations ever recorded in the antebellum South. The case of Magnolia Harrington and her master, Theodore Whitman, would challenge everything the community thought they knew about power, intelligence, and the dangerous games played behind closed doors in the grand plantation houses that dotted the Virginia countryside. Theodore Whitman owned one of the largest tobacco plantations in Culpeper County, spanning over 2,000 acres along the Rappahannock River. His estate, known as Whitman's Rest, housed 43 enslaved individuals who worked the fields and maintained the imposing Georgian mansion that had been in his family for 3 generations. At 38 years old, Theodore was considered one of the most eligible widowers in the county, having lost his wife Margaret to consumption 2 years prior. He lived alone in the sprawling house with only his domestic servants for company, conducting his affairs with the methodical precision that had made his plantation one of the most profitable in the region. Among the enslaved population at Whitman's Rest lived a young woman named Magnolia Harrington. Born on the plantation in 1839, she had been raised in the house rather than the fields, learning to read and write alongside the Whitman children before Theodore's father had deemed such education inappropriate. By 1857, at 18 years of age, Magnolia had developed into what the county records would later describe as a woman of uncommon beauty and intelligence. She worked primarily in the main house, managing the household accounts and serving as Theodore's personal secretary, a position that granted her unusual access to the master's private affairs and business dealings. The first signs that something was amiss at Whitman's Rest emerged in late September 1857, when several neighboring plantation owners began commenting on Theodore's increasingly erratic behavior during their weekly gatherings at the Culpeper courthouse. Previously known for his sharp business acumen and conservative nature, Theodore began making unusual financial decisions that puzzled his contemporaries. He sold prime farmland at below-market prices, dismissed his overseer without explanation, and most peculiarly, began spending long hours locked in his study, with only Magnolia present to assist him with what he claimed were important legal documents. Dr. Samuel Morrison, the county's most respected physician and Theodore's longtime friend, later testified that he had visited Whitman's Rest in early October and found his friend in a state of profound agitation. Theodore spoke incoherently about changing his will and making provisions for the future that would ensure his plantation's legacy. When Dr. Morrison inquired about the nature of these changes, Theodore became defensive and claimed that Magnolia had revealed certain truths about his late wife's wishes that required immediate attention. The physician noted that Theodore appeared to be suffering from severe insomnia and had developed a nervous tic that caused his hands to tremble uncontrollably. The transformation in Theodore's behavior coincided with a series of late-night activities at the plantation that disturbed both the enslaved community and neighboring estates. Field hands reported hearing Theodore and Magnolia engaged in heated conversations that extended well into the early morning hours, often accompanied by the sounds of furniture being moved and papers being shuffled. The overseer's replacement, James Crawford, documented several instances where he discovered Theodore wandering the plantation grounds before dawn, muttering to himself and carrying what appeared to be legal documents. When Crawford attempted to inquire about these nocturnal activities, Theodore dismissed him curtly and warned him against interfering in matters beyond his understanding. The situation reached a critical point in mid-October when Theodore summoned his lawyer, Cornelius Ashford, to the plantation for an emergency meeting. Ashford, who had managed the Whitman family's legal affairs for over 20 years, was shocked by the proposed changes to Theodore's will. According to Ashford's later testimony, Theodore wanted to establish an unprecedented arrangement that would grant Magnolia significant control over the plantation's operations and provide her with substantial financial resources. The lawyer strongly advised against such radical alterations, warning Theodore that the proposed changes would likely face serious legal challenges and social opposition. Theodore's response was described by Ashford as bordering on hysterical, with the plantation owner insisting that he had discovered information that compelled him to take immediate action. What Ashford did not learn until much later was the nature of the information that had so profoundly affected Theodore's judgment. Through a careful campaign that had begun months earlier, Magnolia had gradually convinced her master that his late wife Margaret had hidden crucial evidence about the plantation's true ownership. Using forged letters purportedly written by Margaret before her death, Magnolia claimed that the original land grants contained errors that could invalidate Theodore's title to significant portions of his property. The documents, written in what appeared to be Margaret's handwriting, suggested that only by following specific instructions regarding the treatment and manumission of certain enslaved individuals could Theodore protect his family's legacy from potential legal challenges. The forgeries were masterfully crafted, incorporating details about the plantation's history that only someone with intimate knowledge of the family's private affairs could have known. Magnolia had spent years observing Margaret's correspondence habits, studying her handwriting, and learning the intimate details of the couple's private conversations. The fake letters referenced conversations and events that only Margaret would have known, creating a psychological trap that exploited Theodore's grief and guilt over his wife's death. Each document built upon the previous ones, creating an increasingly complex narrative that portrayed Margaret as having discovered dangerous secrets about the plantation's legal foundation shortly before her death. The psychological manipulation extended beyond the forged documents to include a series of carefully orchestrated incidents designed to reinforce Theodore's growing paranoia and dependence on Magnolia's guidance. She arranged for specific books to disappear from his library and reappear in unexpected locations, always accompanied by cryptic notes allegedly left by Margaret. Personal items belonging to his deceased wife began appearing in rooms where they had no logical reason to be, each discovery coinciding with Magnolia's presentation of new evidence about the supposed legal threats facing the plantation. The cumulative effect of these incidents created an atmosphere of supernatural dread that undermined Theodore's rational thinking and made him increasingly susceptible to Magnolia's suggestions. As October progressed, Theodore's behavior became increasingly erratic and isolated. He dismissed most of his house staff, retaining only Magnolia and two elderly servants who had worked at the plantation for decades. His correspondence with business associates became sporadic and incoherent, leading several creditors to express concern about the plantation's financial stability. Dr. Morrison made several attempts to visit his friend, but was repeatedly turned away by Magnolia, who claimed that Theodore was suffering from a nervous condition that required complete rest and isolation. The physician's concerns deepened when he learned from other county residents that Theodore had been seen walking the plantation boundaries at night, apparently searching for landmarks mentioned in the forged documents. The crisis reached its peak on the evening of October 28, 1857, when Theodore completed the final version of his revised will in the presence of two witnesses summoned by Magnolia. The document, which would later be described by legal experts as one of the most unusual testaments ever recorded in Virginia, granted Magnolia immediate freedom upon Theodore's death, along with ownership of 500 acres of prime farmland and a substantial cash inheritance. More importantly, The will appointed her as executor of the estate, with broad powers to manage the plantation's operations and make decisions regarding the other enslaved individuals. The witnesses, both elderly residents of Culpeper County who had known the Whitman family for decades, later testified that Theodore appeared to be in a state of extreme agitation during the signing ceremony, frequently referencing his dead wife's wishes and claiming that he was fulfilling a sacred obligation to protect the family's honor. What none of the witnesses realized at the time was that the signing ceremony represented the culmination of a months-long psychological campaign that had systematically destroyed Theodore's mental stability and rational judgment. Magnolia had studied her master's weaknesses with the calculating precision of a military strategist, exploiting his grief, guilt, and social isolation to create a perfect storm of vulnerability. She understood that Theodore's love for his deceased wife represented both his greatest strength and his most exploitable weakness, and she crafted her deception to transform that love into a weapon against his own interests. The morning after the will's completion brought an unexpected development that would forever change the trajectory of the case. Theodore was discovered in his study by one of the elderly servants, slumped over his desk with what appeared to be a final letter addressed to his lawyer. The local physician who examined the body determined that death had resulted from what he termed a failure of the heart, likely brought on by extreme emotional distress and prolonged sleeplessness. The letter, which was never made public but was referenced in subsequent legal proceedings, allegedly contained Theodore's confession that he had been manipulated but felt powerless to resist the psychological hold that Magnolia had established over him. The discovery of Theodore's death triggered an immediate legal challenge to the validity of his will, led by his distant cousins, who stood to inherit the plantation under the previous version of the document. Their investigation, conducted with the assistance of a private detective from Richmond, uncovered the sophisticated nature of Magnolia's deception within weeks of Theodore's death. Handwriting experts determined that the letters allegedly written by Margaret Whitman were skillful forgeries, while examination of the plantation's historical records revealed that the legal threats referenced in the documents were entirely fabricated. The investigation also uncovered evidence that Magnolia had been systematically stealing small amounts of money from the household accounts over several years, using the funds to purchase materials needed for her forgery operation. The legal proceedings that followed Theodore's death exposed the full scope of Magnolia's manipulation and raised disturbing questions about the psychological vulnerabilities that had made her deception possible. Testimony from plantation workers revealed that she had spent months studying Theodore's habits and emotional patterns, carefully timing her revelations to coincide with periods when he was most susceptible to suggestion. The forged letters had been introduced gradually over a period of several months, each one building upon Theodore's growing paranoia and dependence on Magnolia's interpretations of their meaning. Expert witnesses testified that the psychological manipulation represented one of the most sophisticated confidence schemes ever documented in the region. Despite the overwhelming evidence of fraud and manipulation, the legal challenge to Theodore's will faced significant obstacles due to the complex racial and social dynamics of antebellum Virginia society. The court struggled to address a case where an enslaved person had successfully manipulated a white plantation owner, as such an outcome challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of slavery and racial hierarchy. Some legal observers argued that recognizing Magnolia's intelligence and strategic thinking would undermine the ideological foundations that justified the institution of slavery itself. Others contended that Theodore's mental state at the time of the will's creation made it impossible to determine his true intentions, regardless of the circumstances that had influenced his decision. The resolution of the case came in the spring of 1858, when a compromise agreement was reached between the competing parties. The courts declared Theodore's final will invalid due to evidence of fraud and undue influence, but acknowledged that the previous version of the document contained provisions for Magnolia's eventual freedom that appeared to reflect Theodore's genuine intentions. She was granted her freedom along with a small financial settlement, but was required to leave Virginia permanently and forfeit any claim to the plantation or its assets. The arrangement satisfied none of the parties involved, but represented the only politically acceptable resolution to a case that had exposed uncomfortable truths about intelligence, manipulation, and power in the antebellum South. Magnolia's departure from Virginia in June 1858 marked the end of her direct involvement in the case, but questions about her ultimate fate and the broader implications of her actions continued to fascinate observers for years to come. Some reports suggested that she had traveled north to Pennsylvania, where she established a new identity and used her education and intelligence to build a successful life as a free woman. Others claimed that she had simply disappeared into the complex network of free black communities that existed throughout the border regions between North and South. What remained clear was that her manipulation of Theodore Whitman had demonstrated intellectual capabilities that challenged prevailing assumptions about the nature of human bondage and the individuals who lived under its constraints. The Whitman plantation itself never fully recovered from the scandal and psychological trauma associated with the case. Theodore's cousins, who eventually inherited the property, struggled to maintain its profitability in the face of ongoing gossip and speculation about the strange events that had occurred there. Several overseers quit their positions after reporting unexplained sounds and disturbances in the main house, leading to persistent rumors that the plantation was somehow cursed or haunted by the unresolved tensions surrounding Theodore's death. The property was eventually sold in 1862 to cover mounting debts, and the grand mansion was demolished in 1868 after suffering significant damage during the Civil War. The broader implications of Magnolia's deception extended far beyond the immediate participants and continued to influence discussions about slavery, intelligence, and psychological manipulation throughout the remaining years before the Civil War. Abolitionists seized upon the case as evidence that enslaved individuals possessed intellectual capabilities that belied the racist justifications for their bondage, while defenders of slavery argued that the incident demonstrated the dangerous consequences of allowing enslaved people access to education and positions of trust within plantation households. The case became a touchstone for debates about the nature of human intelligence and the ways in which social circumstances could either constrain or unleash individual potential. In 1863, 5 years after Magnolia's departure from Virginia, a graduate student at the University of Virginia attempted to conduct a comprehensive investigation of the case as part of his thesis on psychological manipulation and social control in the antebellum South. His research, which involved interviews with surviving participants and analysis of legal documents, uncovered additional details about the sophistication of Magnolia's operation that had not been revealed during the original legal proceedings. The student discovered evidence that she had maintained a secret correspondence with educated free blacks in Richmond and Washington, suggesting that her scheme may have been part of a broader network of resistance activities rather than simply an individual effort to secure her freedom. The thesis was never completed, as the researcher disappeared during a trip to interview former plantation workers in the spring of 1864. His notes, which were discovered in his dormitory room several weeks later, contained fragmentary references to additional cases of psychological manipulation involving enslaved individuals throughout the Virginia countryside. The university administration declared the research project closed and archived the materials, where they remained until a fire destroyed much of the historical collection in 1897. The loss of these documents meant that many questions about the broader implications of Magnolia's case would never be definitively answered. The passage of time has only deepened the mystery surrounding the true extent of Magnolia's intelligence and the ultimate consequences of her manipulation of Theodore Whitman. Modern historians who have studied the fragmentary records that survive from the case have noted the sophisticated understanding of human psychology that her scheme demonstrated, suggesting capabilities that far exceeded what most contemporary observers believed possible for someone living in bondage. The precision with which she exploited Theodore's emotional vulnerabilities and the months of careful planning required to execute her deception indicate a level of strategic thinking that challenges simplistic assumptions about the intellectual development possible under slavery's constraints. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of Magnolia's story lies not in the manipulation itself, but in the questions it raises about how many similar cases may have occurred without ever being discovered or documented. The antebellum South was built upon a complex web of personal relationships and psychological dependencies that created numerous opportunities for subtle manipulation and coercion. The isolation of plantation life, combined with the intense emotional dynamics that characterized master-slave relationships, provided ideal conditions for the kind of psychological warfare that Magnolia practiced with such devastating effectiveness. The possibility that her case represented not an isolated incident, but merely the most visible example of a widespread phenomenon, adds a particularly disturbing dimension to our understanding of slavery's psychological impact on both enslaved and enslaving populations. The records that do survive from the Theodore Whitman case continue to fascinate researchers and legal historians who study the complex dynamics of power and resistance in the antebellum South. The sophistication of Magnolia's psychological manipulation, combined with her apparent ability to maintain her deception for months without detection, suggests intellectual capabilities that were systematically denied and suppressed by the institution of slavery. Her success in transforming Theodore's love for his deceased wife into a weapon against his own interests demonstrates a profound understanding of human nature that challenges comfortable assumptions about the relationship between education, intelligence, and social circumstances. Yet questions remain about the ultimate cost of Magnolia's success, both for herself and for the broader community affected by her actions. The psychological trauma inflicted on Theodore Whitman was severe enough to contribute to his death, while the legal and social upheaval that followed her exposure disrupted the lives of dozens of other enslaved individuals who had no involvement in her scheme. The case serves as a reminder that resistance to oppression, however intellectually sophisticated, often comes at a price that extends far beyond the immediate participants. The moral complexity of Magnolia's actions defies simple categorization as either heroic resistance or criminal manipulation, instead occupying an uncomfortable middle ground that reflects the impossible choices faced by those living under the constraints of human bondage. The ultimate fate of Magnolia Harrington remains one of the most intriguing aspects of a case that continues to generate speculation and debate more than a century and a half after her disappearance from the historical record. Some researchers have suggested that she may have been among the educated African Americans who played important roles in the Underground Railroad during the final years before the Civil War, using her demonstrated skills in psychological manipulation and forgery to assist other enslaved individuals in their escape efforts. Others have proposed that she simply integrated into one of the established free black communities of the North, where her intelligence and education would have allowed her to build a new life far removed from the traumatic circumstances of her youth. The absence of definitive information about Magnolia's later life adds to the unsettling quality of her story, leaving readers to wonder whether justice was ultimately served or whether a brilliant but morally complex individual simply vanished into the shadows of history. The case of Theodore Whitman and the woman who destroyed him through the careful exploitation of his deepest emotions remains a testament to the hidden psychological warfare that characterized so many relationships within the institution of slavery. It serves as a reminder that intelligence and strategic thinking could emerge even under the most oppressive circumstances, often in forms that challenge the fundamental assumptions upon which those circumstances were based. And perhaps that is the most disturbing truth revealed by this forgotten chapter of Virginia history. In a world built upon the systematic denial of human dignity and intellectual capacity, Magnolia Harrington proved that the human mind could not be completely conquered, even when it was legally owned by another. Her victory was incomplete and came at tremendous cost, but it demonstrated possibilities that the defenders of slavery preferred to deny, and that even its opponents struggled to fully comprehend. The sound of her quiet footsteps moving through the halls of Whitman's Rest in those final months before Theodore's death represents something that no amount of legal documentation or social control could completely silence. The persistent whisper of human intelligence refusing to be extinguished regardless of the circumstances that sought to contain it. The legacy of Magnolia's manipulation extended into the post-Civil War era in ways that few could have anticipated during the immediate aftermath of Theodore's death. In 1869, nearly 11 years after her departure from Virginia, a series of documents surfaced in a Philadelphia law office that shed new light on the sophistication of her original scheme. The papers, discovered during the settlement of an unrelated estate, included what appeared to be detailed notes written in Magnolia's distinctive handwriting, outlining not only her psychological manipulation of Theodore, but also her analysis of similar vulnerabilities in other plantation owners throughout the Culpeper County region. The documents suggested that Magnolia had been conducting what amounted to a systematic study of the psychological weaknesses exhibited by slaveholders, cataloging their fears, guilt, and emotional dependencies with the clinical precision of a trained physician. Her notes referenced specific conversations, behavioral patterns, and family histories that she had gathered through years of careful observation and strategic questioning. Most disturbing was her apparent ability to identify which individuals would be most susceptible to manipulation based on their relationships with deceased family members, their financial anxieties, and their social insecurities within the plantation hierarchy. Dr. Jonathan Matthews, a Philadelphia physician and amateur psychologist who examined the documents in 1870, described them as representing one of the most sophisticated analyses of human behavior he had encountered outside of formal academic circles. The notes demonstrated not only Magnolia's natural intelligence, but also her systematic approach to understanding and exploiting the psychological dynamics that governed her world. Matthews theorized that her success with Theodore Whitman may have been the culmination of years of practice and refinement rather than a single inspired deception. The discovery of these documents prompted renewed interest in the original case among researchers studying the psychological dimensions of slavery and resistance. A private investigator hired by the Virginia Historical Society attempted to trace Magnolia's movements after her departure from the state, uncovering fragmentary evidence that she had indeed traveled north, but had maintained contact with an underground network of educated former slaves throughout the 1860s. Several witnesses reported seeing a woman matching her description in various cities between Philadelphia and Boston, always in the company of individuals known to be involved in assistance efforts for newly freed slaves. More intriguingly, the investigator discovered references to a series of unexplained financial irregularities that had affected several prominent families throughout Virginia during the final years before the Civil War. In each case, wealthy plantation owners had made sudden, dramatic changes to their wills or financial arrangements, often following periods of what family members described as unusual anxiety and secretive behavior. While no direct connection to Magnolia could be established, the pattern bore striking similarities to the psychological manipulation she had practiced on Theodore Whitman. The investigation was abruptly terminated in 1871 when the detective hired to conduct the research was found dead in his hotel room in Richmond under circumstances that authorities described as suspicious but inconclusive. His notes, which had been carefully maintained throughout his investigation, disappeared from his room before police could secure them. The Virginia Historical Society officially closed the inquiry, citing concerns about the safety of additional researchers and the sensitive nature of the historical questions being explored. In 1873, 15 years after Theodore Whitman's death, a remarkable incident occurred that brought renewed attention to the psychological dimensions of the original case. A young woman identifying herself as Sarah Washington approached the law office of Cornelius Ashford in Richmond, claiming to possess information about Magnolia Harrington's whereabouts and activities since her departure from Virginia. Sarah, who appeared to be in her early 20s and spoke with the refined accent of an educated northern woman, presented documents that she claimed proved Magnolia had established a successful business in Philadelphia, providing legal and financial consulting services to newly freed slaves. The documents, if authentic, revealed that Magnolia had used her intelligence and understanding of legal manipulation to help dozens of former slaves navigate the complex bureaucratic challenges of establishing new lives in the North. Sarah claimed that Magnolia had developed innovative strategies for helping former slaves document their identities, locate separated family members, and secure employment opportunities that matched their skills and education levels. The consulting business had reportedly become quite successful, allowing Magnolia to accumulate significant wealth while maintaining a low profile that protected her from potential legal challenges related to her past. Cornelius Ashford, who had remained haunted by his role in the Theodore Whitman case for over a decade, agreed to meet with Sarah to examine her documents more closely. During their meeting, she revealed details about the psychological manipulation techniques that Magnolia had employed against Theodore, information that she claimed to have learned through direct conversations with the woman herself. Most shocking was Sarah's assertion that Magnolia had viewed her manipulation of Theodore not as an isolated incident, but as a test case for methods that could be used to help other enslaved individuals secure their freedom through psychological rather than physical resistance. The meeting with Sarah Washington proved to be the final documented contact between any representative of Magnolia Harrington and the Virginia legal community. Ashford's notes from the encounter, discovered among his papers after his death in 1886, indicate that Sarah had promised to arrange a direct meeting between the lawyer and Magnolia herself. But this encounter never materialized. Subsequent attempts to locate Sarah or verify the authenticity of her documents proved unsuccessful, leading some researchers to speculate that the entire incident may have been another elaborate deception designed to gauge ongoing interest in Magnolia's case. The question of whether Sarah Washington was a real person acting on Magnolia's behalf or simply another manifestation of her continued manipulation from a distance, remains unresolved to this day. The sophisticated nature of the information she presented, combined with her intimate knowledge of details that had never been made public, suggests that she had indeed maintained contact with Magnolia, or was possibly Magnolia herself operating under an assumed identity. The timing of the encounter, coming 15 years after the original case and coinciding with renewed historical interest in the psychological dimensions of slavery, may not have been coincidental. As the 19th century drew to a close, the case of Magnolia Harrington and Theodore Whitman had evolved from a local scandal into a subject of broader academic and social interest. Researchers studying the psychological impact of slavery on both enslaved and enslaving populations found in the case a complex example of how intelligence and strategic thinking could emerge even under the most oppressive circumstances. The sophistication of Magnolia's psychological manipulation challenged comfortable assumptions about the intellectual capabilities of enslaved individuals, while raising disturbing questions about the hidden dynamics that may have governed many similar relationships throughout the antebellum South. The final documented reference to the case appeared in 1895. Nearly 40 years after Theodore Whitman's death, in a brief article published in the Journal of Southern History. The article, written by an anonymous contributor who claimed to have personal knowledge of the events, suggested that Magnolia Harrington had indeed survived well into the post-Civil War era and had used her intelligence and psychological insights to build a successful life in the North. According to this account, she had maintained her interest in helping former slaves adapt to freedom, while carefully avoiding any activities that might draw attention to her past or reveal her true identity. The anonymous author claimed that Magnolia had eventually married and raised a family, using her education and business acumen to establish herself as a respected member of Philadelphia's African-American community. Her children had reportedly been told that their mother was a former slave who had purchased her freedom through years of careful saving, a version of events that contained enough truth to be believable, while omitting the more controversial aspects of her actual history. The article suggested that Magnolia had deliberately allowed the truth about her past to remain buried, believing that the full story of her psychological manipulation of Theodore Whitman would serve no useful purpose in the changed circumstances of the post-war world. Whether this final account represents accurate historical information or simply another layer of myth and speculation surrounding Magnolia's story cannot be determined from the available evidence. The author of the 1895 article never revealed his identity, and no additional corroborating evidence has ever been discovered to support his claims about Magnolia's later life. The persistence of interest in her fate, however, suggests that her case had touched upon fundamental questions about human nature, intelligence, and the relationship between oppression and resistance that continued to resonate with observers long after the immediate circumstances of her manipulation had passed into history. The psychological techniques that Magnolia employed against Theodore Whitman would not be formally recognized and categorized by academic psychology until well into the 20th century. Modern researchers studying her methods have noted striking similarities to manipulation strategies that are now understood as forms of psychological warfare, including the systematic exploitation of grief, the creation of artificial dependencies, and the gradual erosion of rational thinking through carefully orchestrated emotional stress. The sophistication of her approach, particularly given her limited formal education and the social constraints under which she operated, suggests an intuitive understanding of human psychology that few trained professionals of her era could have matched. The broader implications of Magnolia's case for understanding the hidden psychological dynamics of slavery continue to generate scholarly interest and debate. Her success in manipulating Theodore Whitman demonstrated that the power relationships that supposedly defined the institution of slavery were far more complex and unstable than its defenders had claimed. The possibility that similar manipulation may have occurred in other cases without detection suggests that the psychological impact of slavery on slaveholders may have been more significant than previously understood, creating vulnerabilities that intelligent and strategic enslaved individuals could exploit under the right circumstances. Yet the moral complexity of Magnolia's actions resists simple interpretation or judgment, even from the perspective of contemporary values that clearly condemn the institution of slavery. Her manipulation of Theodore Whitman involved the deliberate infliction of psychological trauma severe enough to contribute to his death, raising difficult questions about the ethical boundaries of resistance to oppression. The fact that her success came at the cost of significant collateral damage to other enslaved individuals who had no involvement in her scheme adds another layer of moral ambiguity to an already complex case. The case of Magnolia Harrington ultimately stands as a testament to the impossible choices faced by individuals trapped within systems of systematic oppression and dehumanization. Her intelligence and strategic thinking emerged despite circumstances designed to prevent exactly such developments, proving that human capability could not be completely suppressed even under the most restrictive conditions. Yet her victory was incomplete and morally compromised, achieved through methods that inflicted their own form of trauma and injustice, even as they challenged the fundamental assumptions of the system she sought to escape. Today, more than 160 years after Theodore Whitman's death in his study at Whitman's Rest, the sound of Magnolia's footsteps has long since faded from the halls of the plantation house that was demolished in 1868. But the questions raised by her psychological manipulation of her master continue to echo through our understanding of human nature, intelligence, and the complex relationships between oppression and resistance. Her story remains a reminder that even in the darkest circumstances, the human mind retains the capacity for strategic thinking and psychological warfare, often in forms that challenge the comfortable assumptions of those who believe they hold absolute power over others. The ultimate truth about Magnolia Harrington, her fate, her motivations, and the full extent of her capabilities may never be completely known. But perhaps that uncertainty is itself part of the legacy she left behind, a whisper of intellectual possibility that could never be completely silenced, a demonstration that human intelligence would always find ways to emerge and assert itself, regardless of the social and legal constraints designed to contain it. In the end, her greatest victory may have been not the manipulation of Theodore Whitman itself, but the persistent questions her story continues to raise about the nature of power, intelligence, and the indomitable human spirit that refuses to be completely conquered, even when it is legally owned by another.